In this section, we're going to talk about a few of the different ways that we can deliver our applications to our users. When we are serving content from our applications, there are a number of tools that Azure provides to help us ensure we are securely and efficiently delivering that content. We're going to discuss Content Delivery Networks, or CDNs, Azure Front Door, as well as Azure Cache for Redis. So let's start with a traditional delivery. With the simplest deployment, you have a user, who we're going to call Theodore. He's trying to access the content that you're storing. This could be web content or some sort of multimedia file. Either way, each time Theodore makes a request of the content, the source or origin needs to process and then provide that content back to him. The only caching that occurs in this scenario would be on the user's workstation. And since that workstation is most likely only used by Theodore, each time a new user makes a request, the origin needs to process and return everything again. A CDN, or Content Delivery Network, sits between the origin and the users. It can be referred to as an edge server or point of presence. It essentially acts like a man in the middle that gets requests from the users, passes it along to the origin then processes and serves the request and then sends it back to the CDN, which then sends it back to the user. So going back to our previous example, Theodore again is going to request the content. It's going to reach the CDN, which will then pass it along to the source. The source will then respond to the CDN with the content. The CDN in turn then sends that content back to Theodore. This may just seem like an extra step at this point, but when Theodore tells his friends about how awesome your application is, they will attempt to access that same content. This time though, the request will hit the CDN, and since it already has that content cached from when Theodore accessed it, it will then pass the response back to them. This removes a lot of the processing from the source or origin so that it can be free for other requests. Another advantage to CDNs is the ability to more effectively serve our global audience. Since we may have users close to our regional data center or on the other side of the world, we need to keep that content as close as possible. Much like when we talked about with Cosmos DB, the closer the user is to the data, the more likely the application performance will improve, which will also increase the user satisfaction. As you can see here, we're leveraging the CDNs from various regions around the world. This allows users to get content from a local CDN rather than having to transverse intercontinental connections to talk to the region where the web application is deployed. When we deploy a CDN, we don't specify a specific data center. It's considered a global service, so as your content is accessed around the world, it will be cached at one of the many CDNs automatically. There are a number of CDN SKUs available. One from Microsoft will work for a lot of your basic needs, as well as another from Akamai and two from Verizon. Each has their own advantages. For the AZ204, you shouldn't need to worry too much about the specifics of each, but I wanted to make sure you're aware that there are multiple offerings. I've also included a link at the bottom that provides a comparison between each if you'd like to investigate further. Since we're talking about caching, we also need to discuss caching rules. Since we don't want our content to live in cache forever, there may be some items that we don't want cached at all, and we can use caching rules to help manage the cache of both of the items that we want to be cached as well as the ones we don't want to be cached. There are two general types of rules. The first is global, and this is defined at each endpoint and affects all requests on that endpoint. The other is a custom caching rule. This would match specific paths or file extensions. They are processed in order, and the custom rules override the global rules. Typically on your content, you set the cache control header to determine how the content should be cached. We have custom rules to override that cache control header on the CDN, and there are three main settings. The first is bypass. What bypass does is it prevents content from being cached altogether. So if you have something that you absolutely do not want to be cached on the CDN, you can use the bypass caching behavior. The next is override. Override deals with cache duration. This will override the cache duration setting defined on the content. Please note that if the content is set to no cache, the override will obey that and not cache the content. It is only for items that typically would be cached. And the final rule is set if missing. This will honor any existing cache settings defined. However, if there are settings that are not defined, then it will populate those settings with what you have defined within the rule. Examples of this could be max age or minimum freshness. Let's go set up a CDN and take a look at some of the caching rules within. Our goal here is to create a CDN, and let's take a look at some of the rules that we can define within it. So to start, let's go to CDN profiles. And you can see here we don't have anything today, so let's go ahead and create a CDN. We're going to call this Skylines CDN. We're going to put it in the Skylines resource group, and then we're going to select a pricing tier. We're going to go ahead and select the standard tier for this one. Now if we do notice, there is a resource group location that's being defined, but we're not actually defining a location for the CDN itself. and that's because it is a global service. The only reason that the resource group location is mentioned here is because there is some metadata that is associated with the CDN profile, and it needs a place to store that. So in this case, it's going to be East-US for the CDN metadata, but the actual CDNs themselves are going to be a global service. So let's go ahead and hit create for now. And while this goes through and runs, this is going to take a little bit of time. So let's check back here in just a second. All right, it looks like it was successfully created. So let's go ahead and do a refresh. You can see it didn't show up. Sometimes you got to refresh the page. And now we can see our CDN is there. So let's go ahead and select that. And I'm going to kick this off to the left. You can see we've got a pretty straightforward setting here. There's not a lot of properties we define. However, we do need to create an endpoint. And an endpoint is essentially how users are going to access the CDN, and then more importantly, what's the origin for that endpoint, or what's information is being served via that CDN. So let's go ahead and up to endpoint. And then you can see if we look at origin type, we've got a few here. So if we've got storage, so maybe we're hosting a multimedia file, or if we've got a static website hosted in storage, or some other cloud service or whatever. So there's a few different options here. We're going to go ahead and select web app, and then we're going to use the eng-app01 that we've been using and recently used as part of the key vault. And we also need to give it a name. So let's call this Skylines CDN endpoint. And we're going to go ahead and add, and that's going to take a few minutes for that to go through and get created. Alright, you can see that it's created, but it also popped up, so there might be a few minutes before it's actually accessible. So if we open up that endpoint, you can see now we do have a endpoint URL, and if we go to select that, it's going to come back and say page not found. And that's expected right now because it's going through and creating that on all the various CDN endpoints throughout the world. So we're going to go ahead and close this for right now, and while that's populating, let's go through and take a look at some of the rules that we had talked about. So if we go to the rules engine, you can see we don't have any defined right now, and we're working with a global rule. So let's go ahead and add a rule. We'll just call this demo rule 01, and then we need to add a condition. So let's go ahead and add a condition, and let's do device type, and basically saying if the device type equals a mobile device. So now we're going through and filtering, say we're only going to look, or this is only going to apply when the device is a mobile device. So now we're going to add an action. And let's go ahead and take a look at the cache expiration. And then if we look at the cache expiration, you can see we've got a few different options, and we talked about these in the PowerPoints. But we're going to go ahead and we're basically going to say set if missing. So if there is no cache setting defined within the content, we're going to go ahead and apply that. So we're basically going to say the cache expires after 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, and 1 second. So basically we've created a rule to where if the device type is a mobile and there's no cache settings defined, we're going to basically say the cache is valid for 1 day, 1 hour, 1 minute, and 1 second. So let's go ahead and hit save. Alright, you can see that saved. So now let's go back up to overview here. And let's see if our endpoint is now working. And you can see now we've got our to-do list. So now you can see here we've got a CDN pointed up. We know we're leveraging the CDN because of the URL we're accessing. And we also know that we now have a rule defined so that if it's a mobile device and there isn't any cache settings defined, we're automatically going to cache that content for a given time frame.